Have you ever felt like a place just knows is haunted? You walk in and suddenly the air gets a little heavier. You feel that chill running down your spine. Yeah, well, if you haven't, stick around because today we're diving into a place that's famous for giving people that very feeling, the haunted Spanish military hospital, right in the heart of St. Augustine. Welcome back to Old Florida Now, where we're exploring Florida's spookiest haunts leading up to Halloween. I'm Bo Carter, your guide on this Haunted History series. This is episode 2 of our Haunted History series, and today we're talking about one of St. Augustine's most eerie spots. Now, this place has some seriously creepy history, and we're not just talking about the fact that it used to be a hospital during, like, the roughest times in Florida's colonial days. There's more to it than just old medical tools and battlefield wounds. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of why this place is so haunted and just who or what might be haunting it today. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Old Florida Now, where we uncover the rich history and hidden stories of the Sunshine State. Each episode will explore the people, places, and events that shaped Florida's past. Let's dive in.
So picture this. It's 1565, and a Spanish admiral by the name of Pedro Menendez de Avilés sails into the Florida coast. Now, this wasn't just any landing. He steps ashore with a plan, not just to explore, but to establish what would become the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in what we now call the U.S., St. Augustine. Crazy, right? I mean, this is decades before Jamestown or even Plymouth Rock. He names it after St. Augustine of Hippo because he landed around the time of that feast day, you know? But here's the thing. St. Augustine wasn't just some quaint little settlement. Nope. This place was strategic. It was a military outpost meant to keep the French out of Florida. Menendez was sent by King Philip II of Spain with orders to basically take out the French who were hanging out up at Fort Caroline. And man, they had some luck with the weather because a storm scattered the French fleet. Menendez didn't even have to fight at sea. He just kind of walked in and took the place over. And this is where things get real tense. He orders the execution of hundreds of French soldiers after they surrender. Yeah, it was pretty brutal. They even named the nearby inlet Matanzas after the massacre. Matanzas literally means slaughters in Spanish. So St. Augustine, from the very beginning, was more than just a settlement. It was a place of conflict, survival, and power moves. Now, daily life in this new settlement was anything but easy. You've got Spanish settlers trying to make it in this unfamiliar land, and then you've got indigenous groups like the Timucua. Relations were, let's say, complicated. There was some trade, some cooperation, but also a lot of tension. The Spanish were also busy fortifying the place. They knew it was a hot target for the French and English. That's why they started building the famous Castillo de San Marcos about a century later. St. Augustine wasn't just some random dot on the map. It was the center of Spanish power in Florida and a key player in the tug of war between European empires in the New World. And honestly, its story is filled with just wild moments. All right, folks, now let's talk about a place that's seen more than its share of let's call it medical history. The Spanish military hospital. This spot goes way back to the late 1700s, and its original purpose was pretty straightforward. It served the soldiers and settlers in St. Augustine, which, remember, was like a hub for Spanish colonial power in Florida. The hospital was essential in like treating all kinds of illnesses and injuries, especially with all the fighting and diseases going around. Now, the hospital was built on Avilés Street, which, fun fact, used to be called Hospital Street. Makes sense, right? It was a wooden structure back then. And, well, being made of wood, it had its vulnerabilities. The West Wing, for instance, was built during the first Spanish period, but it burned down in 1818, which obviously was a bit of a problem. The East Wing was actually put up by the British during their control of St. Augustine. But Yeah, that didn't last either. It was destroyed in a fire in 1895. So after the fires and a couple centuries of conflict and neglect, the hospital as it originally stood was gone. But here's the cool part. They reconstructed the building on the same site using old Spanish records to make sure it was as accurate as possible. It's like a time capsule of what the hospital looked like during the second Spanish period. You can actually visit it today and see how they treated patients in the late 18th century, which is both fascinating and a little unsettling when you see the tools they used for surgery. Yeah, they've got everything from bone saws to those old-timey apothecary jars where they kept herbs. They had a whole garden behind the hospital where they grew plants like aloe and mint, which they used to make medicines, some of which we still use today, believe it or not. The doctors back then combined European and African medical knowledge to treat their patients. And honestly, their survival rates were surprisingly good considering what they were working with. All right, so medical practices in the 18th century were, well, let's just say not exactly what we'd call advanced today. I mean, doctors back then didn't have the knowledge or tools we rely on now. So when someone got sick or injured, they'd rely on what they knew, which, it was a bit of a mixed bag. One of the big things back then was bloodletting. Yeah, they believed that most illnesses came from an imbalance of the body's four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So naturally, if you were sick, it must mean you had too much blood, right? Or at least that's what they thought. They'd use leeches or lancets to drain the excess blood. And it wasn't just like a rare treatment. It was pretty common for things like fever, gout, and even yellow fever, which didn't exactly work out so well for a lot of patients. Speaking of yellow fever, that was one of the deadliest diseases they faced. They didn't know about mosquitoes being the cause. They thought it came from like bad air or miasma. Same with malaria. They didn't know about germs or bacteria. So a lot of their treatments were kind of guesswork, and herbal remedies were big. People would use plants like chamomile for fevers or lavender for headaches, stuff we still recognize today, but it wasn't backed by like science the way it is now. Now, surgery, and let's talk about surgery. It was pretty brutal, no anesthesia, so patients were often just given alcohol or something to bite down on, and amputation was one of the main treatments for serious injuries, especially on the battlefield. You got hit with a musket ball and they couldn't get it out. Well, they just cut off the limb. And infections, man, without antiseptics or proper sanitation, infections spread like wildfire. However, a lot of people died from infections after surgery rather than from the injuries themselves. And honestly, the doctors were doing the best they could with what they knew. It was a tough time to be a patient, and medicine was just beginning to make strides. But looking back, it's wild to think about how far we've come from those early practices. So if there's one thing we know about St. Augustine, it's that it's seen its fair share of turbulence, and the Spanish military hospital, like the rest of the city, was caught right in the middle of all that. Now let's backtrack a bit. St. Augustine was founded by the Spanish in 1565, right? But over the next couple centuries, the control of the city and this hospital shifted between Spanish, British, and eventually American hands. Here's how it went down. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris handed Florida over to the British. So for the next 20 years, this hospital served British troops and settlers. It's hard to imagine now, but St. Augustine became a military stronghold for the British during the American Revolution. In fact, they used the Castillo de San Marcos, which they renamed Fort St. Mark's, as a prison for captured revolutionaries. Some of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, like Thomas Hayward and Edward Rutledge, were actually held here in St. Augustine. But then in 1784, the Spanish regained control after the war. They came back to a city that was, well, a lot different from how they left it. The British had made their mark, adding second stories to houses and expanding trade routes. But the hospital went back to serving the Spanish soldiers and settlers until Florida was officially ceded to the U.S. in 1821. Now, here's where things get a little more personal. During the Second Spanish period, we've got letters from soldiers and staff who worked at the hospital. One Spanish soldier wrote home about how the heat and disease are more dangerous than any enemy, which, considering the malaria and yellow fever outbreaks at the time, sounds about right. They didn't have much medical knowledge back then, and with all the constant shifting control of the city, the hospital had to adapt. It's amazing to think about the resilience of the people who work there, navigating all those political changes while trying to keep folks alive. So yeah, it's not just a place of medical history, but a symbol of survival through some pretty chaotic times. All right, folks, here's where things start to take a bit of a turn. You know, it wasn't always bustling with life at the Spanish military hospital. By the early 19th century, after Florida was handed over to the United States, this hospital, like many colonial buildings, started to fall into disuse. It wasn't long before it pretty much just decayed. By 1823, it was officially out of operation. But here's the interesting part. Decades later, in the 1960s, archaeologists dug up the site and found the original foundations and artifacts. I mean, they uncovered everything from pottery to medical tools. It was a real glimpse into what life was like back in the Second Spanish period. That led to this big push to reconstruct the hospital. In 1965, they used historical records to rebuild the hospital exactly as it had been in the 1790s. So by 1968, the Spanish military hospital was back. Well, sort of. It wasn't just some random building anymore. They turned it into a museum dedicated to colonial medical practices. Today, you can visit the museum and watch surgical demonstrations, check out the old apothecary, and walk through the herb garden they used for medicinal plants. It's a piece of history that was almost lost to time. But thanks to those restoration efforts, it's here to remind us how far we've come. Now, this is where things get really spooky. The Spanish Military Hospital Museum didn't just gain its reputation for the colonial medicine they practiced. Nope, it's known for being one of the most haunted spots in St. Augustine, and it's not hard to see why. We're talking about a hospital built over an ancient burial ground with thousands of human remains found underneath it. So, when did the first reports of hauntings start? Well, even while the hospital was still functioning back in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were already rumors. People, both patients and staff, claimed they could feel something evil in the air. There are letters from doctors who refused to go into certain rooms saying the atmosphere was just too oppressive. And ever since, visitors have been reporting strange occurrences, footsteps in empty corridors, doors that slam shut on their own, and objects moving around without any help. Some of the most common things people experience are sudden cold spots. You're just walking through and then bam, it feels like you stepped into an ice box. And there are the classic ghostly apparitions. Some folks have seen figures dressed in old military uniforms. And that's how we get to our first ghost, the shadow soldier. He's been seen pacing the corridors, always keeping his head down. They say it's like he's still standing guard. Then there's the morning nurse. She's spotted in the hospital's ward tending to patients that, well, aren't exactly there. People say she just appears in the corner checking on the beds, but never makes eye contact with the living. And let's not forget about the weeping woman. You'll hear her before you see her, just soft crying coming from an empty room. Some believe she's mourning the loss of a loved one who never made it out of the hospital. So, yeah, if you ever take the ghost tour at the Spanish military hospital, you might just run into one of these spectral figures. Just don't be surprised if you leave with more questions than answers. So let's talk about the folks who actually go looking for ghosts. Yeah, we're talking about those paranormal investigators who've spent nights in the Spanish military hospital with all their fancy gadgets. hoping to capture something spooky on camera or audio. A lot of these groups use equipment like EMF detectors, which are supposed to pick up on electromagnetic fields that some believe are connected to paranormal activity. They'll also use EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon recorders, which can supposedly capture ghostly voices that our ears might miss. But here's the thing: while some ghost hunters swear by this equipment, there's quite a bit of debate. Skeptics argue that these devices are just picking up on electrical interference from like wiring in the walls or nearby electronics. And yeah, there's a lot of natural explanations for things like cold spots or strange noises that people experience during these investigations. That said, there are some pretty compelling findings from groups who've investigated the Spanish military hospital. One paranormal team recorded what they believe to be disembodied voices in the morning ward, the place where patients would spend their final moments. They also captured video of strange misty shapes moving through the halls, and some investigators even claim to have felt physical sensations like being touched or pushed. But of course, for every believer, there's a skeptic ready to offer more logical explanation. Some say these experiences could be caused by suggestion, like people expect to see or feel something creepy, so their minds kind of fill in the blanks. Others argue that cold spots and EMF spikes could be caused by drafts or faulty wiring, but the ghost hunters, they're convinced that something beyond the physical world is happening here. Whether you buy into the paranormal or not, it's hard to deny that there's something about the Spanish military hospital that keeps drawing investigators back. And hey, if nothing else, the mystery and the stories are worth a listen, right? So let's get into the big question. Why is the Spanish military hospital still such a hotspot for paranormal activity? I mean, you'd think after all these years it would calm down a bit, right? But nope. It seems like the hauntings are just as active as ever. A lot of people talk about this idea of residual energy. It's like all the trauma and suffering that happened in the hospital somehow left an imprint, kind of like a recording that just keeps playing over and over. The patients who were treated here, they were dealing with battlefield wounds, deadly diseases, you name it. And then you've got the fact that the hospital was built over a burial ground. We're talking thousands of bones under the building. That kind of history doesn't just go away quietly. And, the reports from visitors and staff aren't exactly subtle. People hear crying, see shadows, and feel cold spots in rooms that were specifically used for the dying. Some believe that because so much pain and death occurred here, that energy just lingers. It's like the walls themselves have soaked it in. But with all that said, it's important to remember the human side of this history too. We're not just talking about ghosts. We're talking about real people who lived, fought, and died here. Honoring their stories, their lives, is a big part of what makes this place so significant. It's easy to get caught up in the ghost stories, but there's a deeper history here that deserves our respect. So there you have it, folks, the Spanish military hospital, where medicine, military history, and mystery all collide. From its early days treating soldiers in a growing colony to the eerie hauntings that have made it a ghost hunter's paradise. This place really is a perfect reflection of St. Augustine itself, full of stories that are still very much alive. And maybe that's why we're so fascinated by the supernatural. It's not just about spooky experiences. It's about our connection to the past, to those who came before us. So if you're feeling brave, I'd encourage you, head on down to St. Augustine and visit the Spanish Military Hospital Museum. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, it's a place where history is very much alive. Plus the ghost tours, they're a must, especially around Halloween. And hey, before we wrap up, just a quick reminder, this is just the second in our series of haunted history episodes leading up to Halloween. We've got more chilling stories coming your way, so make sure you're subscribed and don't miss the next episode. And if you've had any spooky experiences of your own, whether it's at the Spanish military hospital or somewhere else, drop us a line. We'd love to hear your stories. All right, that's it for this episode of Old Florida Now. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Thanks for listening to Old Florida Now. Stay tuned for more stories from the Sunshine State's past. Until next time.